Thank you very much, Presidents, Deputy Minister, friends and colleagues. It's a real pleasure to be at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences today and an honour to be invited to deliver this talk. I hope you can hear me even if you can't see me. I'd like to start with a paradox. And the paradox is that the demand for evidence-based policy intensifies even as trust in expertise has seemed to decline. Wiebe Bijker and colleagues, in their fascinating account of the Health Council of the Netherlands, refer to this as the paradox of scientific authority. It's worth saying a word or two as well about expertise. Expertise takes many different forms. Experts are called upon to practice and advise in a wide range of contexts and for very different purposes. In my talk today, I'm going to focus on expert advisors in the context of policy making in modern democracies. I'm also going to draw from my own research on environmental governance, and in particular on a very long-standing study of mine, a bit too long-standing for some of my colleagues, of one of the UK's longest-serving environmental advisory bodies, the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution. How should we define an expert? I offer a working definition, which will be elaborated on later. We might say an expert is an individual with in-depth knowledge and skills relating to a particular field, externally validated through qualifications, certification, peer recognition, and other widely accepted credentials. In my talk, I want to try to address three sets of issues. First of all, I'm going to offer some different models in the sense of representations of expertise and its relation to the policy-making process. In that part of the talk, I draw on a wide range of different disciplines, as well as on public and political discourse about experts. And just an observation, many disciplines have something to say about expertise and its relationship to policy. Often, however, on that subject, they haven't talked very much to each other. So there's a real challenge of bringing together the insights from different disciplines on the role of expertise. So how do we think about expertise? And when I say we, I mean we as citizens as well as scholars. Let me begin by offering two familiar but contrasting models about the role of expertise in decision-making. In the first of these models, which I think you will recognize, experts are represented as rational analysts, delivering dispassionate, authoritative advice for the guidance of those in power. It's a model which embodies a division of labour. The experts provide the evidence and the facts, and it falls to political actors to make judgments of value. This was well expressed by former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in answering a question in the British House of Commons in 1989. I can't do the voice, but what she said was, "Advisers advise and ministers decide." I think this model is well known. There are three problems with it. First of all, over several decades, there's been an extensive and powerful critique of the basic premises of the model, of its conceptions of neutral expertise and of its conceptions of the nature of policy-making processes. Secondly, it doesn't work. In the real world, it fails to persuade and convince. It doesn't bear much resemblance to what happens in actual interactions between experts and policymakers. In fact, as Stephen Turner argues in his recent book on the politics of expertise, little about this model is not misleading. I call this model the linear rational model of relations between experts and policymakers. The third problem, in a way, is that this model, despite the critiques and despite not reflecting reality very much, is extraordinarily tenacious, and we hear it rehearsed almost daily in one policy context or another. There's a very different model, but equally familiar. This is a model in which expert advice is seen as being used selectively and strategically to legitimize decisions or depoliticize contentious issues. Experts in this second model, let's call it the strategic model, are seen as political symbols, and their advice is often used as ammunition in policy conflicts. This model, too, is alive and well. I heard it a couple of weeks ago, for example, on BBC Radio 4's morning news programme, this is not from the morning news programme, this is actually from a letter to the Financial Times, which implicitly refers to this strategic model. According to the letter writer, the sorts of commissions that I've studied in depth are, and I quote, black holes to which politicians consign intractable problems, whose recommendations are invariably ignored by elected officials. So in this second model, this strategic model, policy is seen as having less to do with evidence than with what John Kingdon, the American political scientist, calls the balance of organized forces. It may be a bit more convincing than the linear rational model, but it's also problematic because it implies that knowledge doesn't really matter in the interplay of interests, institutions, and power. And that is not borne out by reality either. For example, if we look back over half a century of environmental policy, it would be absolutely inconceivable that we'd have the range of environmental policies that we have today without the important contributions of environmental science and other relevant forms of knowledge. Are there then some other ways of thinking about expertise in the policy process? If we look at a number of in-depth empirical investigations which have actually looked at how experts practice their expertise and interact with policymakers, then what we find is a set of much more subtle and complex interactions at this so-called interface between expertise and policy. We might find, for example, that experts act as agents of policy learning, synthesizing knowledge, developing ideas, framing or reframing problems, and articulating advice. They also act as boundary workers. They cultivate authority by constructing and defending the boundaries between science and non-science, following the ideas of Gearing in his seminal paper in 1983. But as well as constructing boundaries, experts simultaneously bridge them, skillfully framing their arguments and recommendations so that they make sense to both scientists and policymakers. It's important to recognize that these more subtle conceptions of the relationship between expertise and policymaking have both epistemic and discursive dimensions. In-depth knowledge and expertise in the traditional sense is of course required, but they also practice skillful framing, narrative, the making of judgments, and the building of trust as critical elements of the advisory process. As David Boucher put it in our workshop yesterday, reason and rhetoric are complementary, and what goes on in the world of expert advisory institutions is a very good demonstration of that. So, for example, according to Bijker and colleagues, the reports of the Health Council of the Netherlands actually contain a well-argued reflection on the state of knowledge in relation to the state of the world. And in my own research, I found that the Royal Commission's deliberations came closer to a form of practical public reasoning than to any technically oriented appraisal of the facts. So those are some different representations of expertise and its role in the policy process. I suggest that we might have now to acknowledge another way of thinking about experts, that experts are really not much use at all. This view was quite prominent, for example, in the UK referendum on whether or not to leave the EU. And we can still find it being expressed quite frequently. For example, and this is where I do come to the BBC's morning news programme, one discussant remarked a couple of weeks ago, people don't want to hear from experts. That might be a rather extreme version of the idea that there's been a loss of trust in expertise, but nevertheless we need to think about why such ideas have become prevalent. And that takes me now to considering some of the evidence about whether there has or has not been a loss of trust in expertise. And I'm just going to touch on a number of different sources of such evidence, but I warn you that they represent a very tangled web of conflicting interpretations. So we could look, for example, at what people actually do, people's behaviour. And in that case, I think we must agree with Baroness Honora O'Neill, who argues that in their routine activities, people constantly place trust in many others. They actually do trust others on a daily basis. But we should also note the comment by Tom Nichols in his recent book, The Death of Expertise, when he says that such routine trust is a prosaic matter of necessity and is not the same thing as trusting professionals when it comes to matters of public policy. We can look also at opinion polls. For example, the Ipsos Mori Veracity Index was published again in November last year, and it shows, in fact, that scientists and professors, hurrah, do rather well in such polls. They come out much better than politicians, for example. And if we look at a series of such polls over time, that tends to suggest that professors and scientists are more trusted now than they were 20 or 30 years ago. But we have to be cautious about opinion polls. Typically, they provide snapshots of what people think at a particular moment in time, which may be influenced by many factors. They are very dependent on the specific questions asked. They don't tell us how people form their views and their values, and they also don't tell us whether people's trust in professors and experts is actually well placed. We might take encouragement from the empirical observation that public interest in science is very high. For example, if we look at the popularity of television documentaries about nature or about astronomy, there's great public enthusiasm. David Attenborough's BBC series Blue Planet 2 was the most watched programme in the UK in 2017, with an audience of more than 14 million people. Closely followed, but not quite pipped at the post, by the next most popular programme, which was Strictly Come Dancing. There is, however, countervailing evidence. Of great concern to all of us is the increasing production and consumption of misinformation and the kind of fake news that's already been mentioned, particularly in the digital media. I'm not going to dwell on that because Jose van Dijk will talk about it later this afternoon. But I fully acknowledge that this is a very worrying trend with serious implications for trust in expertise. I would also argue that it needs urgently to be disentangled from legitimate critique of expert claims. And that's very important because, and here I move on to another apparent source of evidence about trust or not in expertise. The apparent rejection of some forms of technoscience seems to reinforce the notion of declining trust in scientists and other experts. So we see, for example, a public uneasiness about particular forms of scientific inquiry. We see challenges to expert claims in science policy controversies, and we see resistance to certain technological developments, as with some biotechnologies, for example, or fracking, certainly currently a big issue in the UK. I would argue that it would be misguided to reach sweeping conclusions about trust in expertise or about, and I put this in quotation marks, public misunderstandings of science from such challenges that we now witness. I suggest that it's very important, crucial for us in the academies and elsewhere to distinguish, on the one hand, willful misinformation and unwarranted rejection of established knowledge from, on the other hand, legitimate questioning of expert claims or particular directions of travel in science and technology. After all, as Tom Nichols also argues in his book, reasoned skepticism is essential not only to science, but also to a healthy democracy. Let me finish this second section of my talk with the observation that mistrust, or at least a degree of skepticism about expertise, may, as one of our younger scientists claimed, be well placed. There are a number of reasons for us to be cautious about placing our trust. Let's set aside for now the phenomenon which I think is not common but does exist, the phenomenon of rogue experts. Let's set that aside. But there might be other reasons to be a bit sceptical. One is that experts are not omnipotent and they get things wrong. The second is that they don't much resemble the neutral, disinterested advisors of the linear rational model of relations between expertise and policy. As David Kennedy argues in his book, A World of Struggle, we should see expert knowledge as human knowledge, a blend of conscious, semi-conscious, and wholly unconscious ideas, full of tensions and contradictions, inhabited by people who have projects and who think, speak, and act strategically. And a further reason for a degree of skepticism is something pointed out also by Stephen Turner. Experts almost by definition have competence in a particular field, usually quite narrowly circumscribed. But experts don't always have what Turner calls competence. That is, the competence to recognize when they've reached the limits of their competence. And then finally, in this section, there's the crucial question of framing. Expert claims will be rejected when the questions being addressed by the experts are not the questions that people actually care about. As the UK House of Lords Science and Technology Committee argued in a very well-received report about science and society, some issues treated by decision makers as scientific issues involve many other factors besides science. Framing the problem wrongly by excluding moral, social, ethical, and other concerns invites hostility. Despite all these complexities, and I come now to the final section of my talk, I believe it is possible to identify factors that generate well-placed trust of and trustworthiness of experts. First of all, we have the attributes and the practices of expert advisors themselves. What kinds of attributes generate trust? There's an enormous amount to be said here, and I can use only a few examples. But the body that I studied, the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, was, for the 40 or so years of its existence, and for the most part, a trusted body. So what did it do? How did it behave in order to be trusted? And it seems that amongst its most important attributes in that respect were authority, by which I'm referring to epistemic authority, and autonomy, which one civil servant described to me as the independence thing. But these attributes can't simply be proclaimed. They must actively be constructed and maintained over periods of time. And there are different ways in which this is done by advisory bodies. As Stephen Hillgartner reminds us, an advisory body must assert, cultivate, and guard its own authority, and indeed its independence. Furthermore, such characteristics must be conferred upon the body by others, including governments, as well as believed in by itself. And thirdly, we must see affirmation of attributes like authority and autonomy in real material outcomes over time. In other words, the body must be shown to have effect, or nobody will trust it anymore. All of those requirements seemed to hold for the commission that I studied, and they held in part because as an advisory body, it engaged in a range of both epistemic and discursive practices. I have time probably for only one example of these, but it is a rather interesting example. And it relates back to the point I made earlier about advisors acting as boundary workers. Interestingly, the Commission acquired epistemic authority by positioning itself and by being positioned by others as a scientific body. If you like, it gained a lot of numinous legitimacy, and occasionally its life was saved by the fact that it was seen as a scientific body. But there's a very interesting twist to this source of authority, because in fact the Commission was a much more heterogeneous body whose members, usually numbering about 14, embraced a wide range of disciplines. natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities. It was this breadth of expertise, in addition to the epistemic authority of individual members, that enabled the Commission to adopt what I call its sort of signal practice of interdisciplinary deliberation. And it was through that interdisciplinary deliberation that it became both reflective on what it was doing and reflexive in sometimes changing its conception of what it was working on. And that helped it very much to produce robust, skillfully framed reports. Milena Ziegfurs asked yesterday in our workshop whether synergy between different disciplines, different kinds of knowledge, is a way of increasing trustworthiness. And I can say that in the case of this body that I examined in depth, yes, that synergy was certainly a very important way of increasing trustworthiness. The other things that it did, which I don't have time to go into in depth, was that it fiercely guarded and practiced its own independence. For example, it chose its own subjects for investigation, sometimes very inconveniently for the government. It resisted bureaucratic and political interference, and it was determined always not to be, in any sense, an arm of government at all, as one civil servant put it to me. In challenging conventional frames in many of its reports, it exhibited a certain fearlessness in the delivery of its advice, and that too helped it to be trustworthy. Very briefly, let me say something about the institutional processes through which advice is sought and delivered, because that too relates to the attributes of trust and trustworthiness. All I can do here is raise some questions. Is the system open or closed, transparent or opaque? Are those seeking advice prepared to be robustly challenged, or do they wish only to have their views reinforced? Some of the Commission's most effective reports in causing long-lasting changes to environmental policy were extremely disruptive, and the advice was very unwelcome in the short term, but nevertheless it was the most effective in the longer term. We might ask also, in what sense are the advisors themselves accountable? But a note of caution on this, on these institutional processes through which trust might be generated. There are some significant tensions between, for example, openness, transparency, and providing space for an advisory body to deliberate. There is also a tension between autonomy, remaining fully independent and being fearless in offering your advice, and accountability, at least of the more mechanistic, box-ticking variety. I note here that in my research, when I was asking people why they trusted the Commission, they nearly always referred to its independence and hardly ever to its accountability. Let me finish with a few remarks about the political context for advice and the nature, or including the nature, of the issues being considered. Because in certain circumstances, the questions that arise about expertise, trustworthiness, and trust are particularly challenging. This is the case, for example, in my field of environmental governance, and it's particularly acute in areas of environmental risk. In these sorts of controversial areas, some or all of the following nearly always apply. Evidence is almost always incomplete. and profound uncertainties and ignorance, unknown unknowns, abound. Both of those can be reduced by further research, but they probably can't ever be eliminated, given the complexity of the environmental systems involved and of human-environment interactions. These issues are also characterized typically by high economic and political stakes, so they're fraught issues. They're characterized by, or rather the underlying issues, are grounded in divergent values and beliefs. And what's so interesting about this divergence is that the different world views on these issues don't divide neatly along familiar lines of experts and the public on the different sides. Rather, we find informed people of goodwill, scientists as well as policymakers, journalists, civil society organisations and others, on both sides of these debates. All of these characteristics take us firmly into the realm of regulatory or post-normal science, where we can't reasonably expect controversies to be settled by the facts. How then do we talk about experts and their role in the policy process? We might want to say, I often want to say, that good evidence is defensible evidence. But in many environmental controversies, the defensibility of the evidence itself becomes bound up inextricably with the conflict. So I conclude with a suggestion, but I think it is now well supported by social scientific research on actual advisory practices in real-world policy processes. And that is that in these difficult situations where the issues are contested, the most effective expert advice may involve the purposeful and constructive hybridization of science and politics. Thank you very much.